welcome to the show. This is What a Scream, the podcast, where I, your host, Ogali Mistali, chats horror movies with a special guest every week. And in particular, we discuss two horror films in spoilerific detail that we feel best encapsulates a certain subject or genre that I have previously randomly picked. I keep saying encapsulate, but I'm kind of unsure if that's the right word, and I keep forgetting to look it up. So, fuck it. If it's not the right word, oh well, it is now. I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. We have hit. This is possibly episode number 27. Yeah, I can't believe that. I know I keep saying this, but I really can't believe that I've managed to carry it on this far. Who knew that I could commit to anything? Apart from my husband, of course. So yeah, I hope you're enjoying all of the themes we've had so far. Now, this theme this week is one that I'm going to admit I've been quite ignorant about. Stupidly enough, it hasn't really crossed my radar, and that is really due to my own ignorance. I'm going to absolutely admit it. And then since kind of exploring and researching for this week's podcast, I've really gotten into it, and I'm definitely going to right that wrong. So this week's theme is horror movies from Latin America, or the continent of South America. Of course, everyone knows about Guillermo del Toro, and he's a Mexican director, and I would know all about him, but I understand a lot of his films are set in Spain, so I really wanted to look at films that are set within the continent of South America or Latin America. So I did quite a deep dive on them, and to be honest, I don't know why they were not on my radar, because there are some great horror films coming out of that continent, and yeah, just through my own stupidity. So this week, my special guest is Tim Coleman. He is a freelance writer for publications such as Total Films. He also is the editor at Moving Pictures Club, which I am a contributor to. And he is just a well of knowledge when it comes to movies and horror films, and he's one of those type of guests, which a lot of my guests are. I would like to just cut open their skulls and scoop out their brains and eat their brains and hope that their knowledge gets what's the word? Not marinated. Absorbed. That's the right word. Oh my gosh. I could absorb their knowledge through eating their brains. So yeah, I'm sure Tim's never going to call me again after this, after hearing that, but sure luck. Here we go. So yes, I chat with Tim Coleman about horror movies from Latin America, and in particular we cover two amazing films to come out of them that really have such a rich commentary as well. We cover Terrified, which is a film from Argentina. It is on Shudder if you are looking for it. It is from 2017 and directed by Damien Rugna. And then we also cover a Brazilian film called Morto no Fala, or Dead Don't Speak. And as I said, that is a Brazilian film, and again, it has an amazing social commentary in it, as well as being kind of interesting. So yeah, here is my chat with Tim Coleman about two horror films from Latin America. I would like to welcome to the podcast Tim Coleman. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. Have you been enjoying the recent spate of horror releases?
Yeah, definitely. I guess it's been the de facto reality over the last year and a half, with cinemas being largely closed. Obviously, they've just reopened. I'm in England, so here in England, they reopened. Let's say about 3 weeks ago. So It's been good being able to get to the pictures to see a few. Like I went to see Quiet Place 2 and Freaky, which have been fun. But yeah, catching some stuff on VOD as well, like or on streaming, like things like when we're recording, the first Fear Street from Netflix has just come out last Friday. So lots of good stuff. Feels like the ongoing golden age of horror is continuing. How about you?
Our Ireland has started to open up, and I just had my first cinema visit last week. I went to see Ben Wheatley's In the Earth.
Amazing.
Which was just amazing. I recommend everyone to go see it in the cinema, because it's definitely a cinematic experience. So yeah, I'm happy that the world is starting to open up again.
yeah, for sure. It feels. I don't know if you felt the same way. I felt like it was quite surreal going back into a cinema after such a long break, and you kind of have the muscle memory of how it feels with being in the chairs and like feeling just being in that space, like experiencing films in those sacred rooms again. It feels like very.
I felt like a kid again, the first time you go to the cinema as a kid and it's like this massive experience and you're like, oh my God, that's how I felt.
Yeah, similar. It felt, like going home as well, like part of you just remembers like, oh yeah, this is what it feels like to be back in my safe space.
Yes. So for anyone that doesn't know who you are, would you like to give us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a freelance film critic with a particular interest in horror and horror adjacent content or genre films. So I freelance for a few different outlets, places like Total Film and Jump Cut Online, and I also host and edit a genre website called Moving Pictures Film Club, where we're kind of got a suite of fantastic writers who are kind of looking at different horror films, both as new releases but retrospectives, and just basically celebrating the genre.
And how did you get into horror?
So I probably have a very boring / cliched answer, which is the same for a lot of people, I imagine, was that you got into it probably way too young, like saw stuff when you shouldn't do. I had quite liberal parents, and so I have like really warm memories now. I think I was probably quite scared as a child, seeing things like Halloween and The Thing and The Terminator and a lot of those late 70s and 80s films when I was about maybe somewhere in 9, 10, 11, that kind of age. Just I think when you experience something as involving and something which is as transportative as horror, I think almost more than any other genre, seems to, like, when you experience it at a young age, just breeds a deep love in people for it. And so although maybe young me was quite frightened by some of those experiences, like certainly my personal connection with a number of those films has maintained and continued to be really strong, so that going back to them definitely feels like comfort food to me. And now it's to the point where I'm a father as well, getting to start to introduce some of them, probably in slightly more restrained than my own parents were. Like I haven't yet shown things like The Thing to my 12-year-old. But yeah, you just fell in love with the genre at that kind of formative age, and it hasn't really left me since.
Yeah, I read a book recently, and it was about like why we love horror, and it had a chapter on child psychology when it comes to children seeing a horror film or being into horror. And it said that children that are into kind of horror and experience it from a young age are more able to deal with say real world experiences because they have been in a controlled environment experiencing horror and fear. Do you think that's true?
I absolutely agree with that. I think then there's a real psychological benefit and emotional benefit, I think, to being able to experience these quite what can be quite disturbing or upsetting emotions, but within a safe space of a 90-minute film where things are quite clearly fantastical in their parameters. So like I mentioned, for example, The Thing, The Terminator a moment ago, and no one is realistically, although it's 2021, anything could happen, but if I was superstitious, I'd be touching wood now. But no one is realistically worried about kind of parasitic invaders from another world or a cyborg traveling through time to wipe out the savory of the human race. But what you are able to do through those films is kind of confront things like fear of mortality, fear of illness, fear of relational breakdown. And a lot of our horror films are fundamentally about confronting those things and then dealing with it. And you go through the cathartic journey with whoever the characters like Sarah Connor or R.J. McCready, and you then come out the other end having exorcised something of your own anxiety about it. I mean, it extends, I think, to cinema more widely. I mean, these aren't horror films, but like Disney, for example, and I know it's a bit of a cliche, but Disney is very good about putting death in its films, like often the deaths of parents, because that is, to a child, the most upsetting thing that you can think of. But actually, it's a really helpful way of like opening up those discussions. And actually, I know things like The Lion King, for example, gave a platform for me to then talk to my kids about things like death and starting to begin to have those difficult conversations. And so I think actually having cinema and art in general, which is confrontational and will take you to those places, is really important, because our culture, I think, shies away from those discussions a lot of the time, and actually having a place where you can think about it and experience some of those feelings in a safe space is really, really important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Obviously, my son's Tree, so he's still quite young, but we do watch the Disney films, and he's seen all the the death in the Lion King and everything. But I've always wondered, this sounds really weird, at what point do I introduce him to horror? He's into like the spooky stuff, like the vampires and the witches and the pumpkins, but I'm like, at what age do I say, have a look at this, because it shaped me who I am and I'm kind of okay? So what do you think of that? When did you start kind of introducing your kids, or have you started yet?
Yeah, no, I've tried, I guess, my personal barometer, and trying to like have that open discussion with my partner as well, and just being like, what she thinks about these things. Because I'm probably a little bit more liberal on this stuff than she is, just because of my background. As I said, I saw all this stuff really young. But I think like my personal barometer is I never want to disturb them to the point where it's not fun at this age, because for me, it's about safety, and it's about actually experiencing the thrill of a scare. But I don't want to give them nightmares. I don't want them to be up like half the night, really full of existential dread.
Yeah, and think of all the therapy bills as well, like you're saying.
Well, but then if you get that sweet spot where you are pitching it just right, that in itself is therapy as well. And so, so like I mentioned, I've got a 12-year-old. So for her, I started out with things like The Burbs, like the Joe Dante pick, which is kind of really spooky but really fun, like stuff like Gremlins 2. And now that she's a little bit older, we're looking at some of the stuff which is maybe like 15s, but it's like not scary stuff like Tremors, stuff like actually one of her favorite films is A Quiet Place, which is quite scary, but I think it's not a nasty film, like it's in the like Quiet Place is one of those great films which is thrilling and exciting, but it's also a kind of quite profound meditation on grief and like a family surviving trauma, and it's got a very different tone to perhaps something of a similar sophistication like The Lighthouse, for example, which is this kind of Lynchian sexual abstract nightmare, which is quite, I think that's like a stronger cup of coffee for a child. So but I mean, at the end of the day, every parent knows their kids the best, and I guess it's just about pitching it what you think's appropriate for the child in a way that's going to be fun, not harmful but helpful.
I was thinking about how I was kind of introduced to the world of horror, which is through Tim Burton films. I mean, say what you want about Tim Burton, but he was a lot of gateway drugs, like a gateway drug for people. And my little boy is into Nightmare Before Christmas, absolutely loves it. Has watched Frank and Weenie, all that kind of stuff. So I think I might move on to perhaps Gremlins as well, because they're cute and kind of funny.
Yeah, definitely. And the second one in particular is like a lower certification, and it's more goofy, for sure. Yeah, I mean stuff like Tim Burton movies or like a studio, stuff like Coraline as well. Like, apart from anything, those are good films, right? Like, you want to show your kids quality cinema.
Yeah, it's funny how horror is such a tradition. You don't see this kind of handing down from generation to generation in many other genres of film. You wouldn't be like, oh, I love this romantic comedy. Here, child, watch this. You know, it just doesn't have the same kind of almost folkloric tradition.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, maybe it's because historically, horror has been around since time immemorial as things like campfire stories, where you would tell these stories. Like, I mean, for example, to my 12-year-old, and that literally begins with an old man telling kids around a campfire a ghost story before it then plays out on screen. I mean, people just like being scared, right? It's just built into our DNA, and I think, yeah, that kind of element of passing things down a generation, and also just sharing the things that you love. Like, if it's part of your DNA, if it's part of who you are and the way you see the world, I think there's nothing better than sharing that with the people you love, not least your own children.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the theme of this week's podcast. It's one which I'm going to admit I was really ignorant about. Like, I'd actually never watched a movie within this genre, which is ridiculous. But it is horror from South America. Now, what did you think of the theme?
Yeah, I'll admit, when you got in touch and said this is what we're going to be looking at, I was suddenly struck by a moment of self-doubt and thinking, well, have I seen many films from South America? And I'll say that perhaps it's relatively, for me, a bit of a gap in terms of genre films from South America or Latin America. I think if we expand it slightly to talk about Latin America more generally, so we're kind of including the Caribbean and Mexico in particular, then I think it widens it up a little bit further than that. But I was kind of like, is it just that I haven't seen a lot of stuff, or? But when I kind of started reading around the topic, apparently, historically speaking, there hasn't been perhaps a great history of Latino horror films, in perhaps the same way that some other genres have thrived cinematically, from that culture. So it's interesting that maybe when we throw our minds back 20 years, we could probably name quite a few, particularly kind of from Pan's Labyrinth on, if we're taking that as like a helpful kind of time where that kind of broke through to the West in terms of popular titles. But yeah, so I probably sent some of those heavy hitters, which a lot of people would have done, but I would in no way class myself an expert on this particular section of horror cinema.
Yeah, because even like with Guillermo del Toro, he is a Mexican director, but yet he sets a lot of his films in Spain. Why do you think that there hasn't been a tradition of setting, Latin America horror films in Latin America? Why is it always, emigrated outwards to Spain and Portugal?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, when I was kind of preparing for today, I was reading a kind of an essay by an academic called Jesse Alaman, and I should say from the top, apologies to all of our Latino or Spanish listeners, that my pronunciation is not going to be good throughout. I'm sorry. But yeah, Alaman was kind of talking about how if you could compare, for example, Mexican cinema to American cinema as the nearest major cinema producing country to the north. There isn't that horror tradition, but there is this rich tradition of things like political documentaries, street films, prison movies, that kind of thing. And I guess you could argue that perhaps the stuff that was proliferating that was the fact that in dominant hegemonic American culture, Latinos were often already kind of demonized and kind of already portrayed as the other. So one of the examples that Alaman pulls out is from the Keanu Reeves movie Constantine, where the son of Satan literally is a Mexican immigrant hopping the border, and it talks and some of the language in that film was around deporting them back to hell, and it's kind of very thinly veiled othering of Mexican and Latino people. And I guess in terms of why then that hasn't fed into the cinematic tradition in Mexico and in Latin America from an earlier period, maybe it was just about confronting that a little bit and trying to not explicitly play in that sandbox, or maybe I mean, the political history, and we'll probably come on to this a little bit more when we're talking about some of the films later on, but the political history of those countries has been far more turbulent in the last 50 years than perhaps nations like the States. I mean, in Spain, obviously, it hasn't been without its political issues, but like perhaps not as recently as countries like Argentina, like Mexico, for example. I mean, what's interesting is that there has been that shift, I guess, in the last 20 years where there are a number of filmmakers, a number of films which are kind of broken through a bit more to Western mainstream through people like Del Toro championing them, or through streaming services like Shudder, like taking Latino films and then publicizing them. So it feels like there's been a bit more of a sea change in the last 20 years. But yeah, it's interesting that not so much before then, apparently.
Yeah. One thing I found really interesting about watching these films is how much they are set in that culture, in that community. Something that you don't really feel when it comes to American cinema, or, British or kind of Eurocentric cinema. It's kind of very similar to like Japanese or Korean cinema, where it's so ingrained in this community, in this culture, that it couldn't be set anywhere else. And when there's talks of like remakes, I don't know how you feel about remakes of like, other language films, but it infuriates me because I feel like part of the story, part of the heart of the film is because it is set within that community, within that culture. And I really got this massive feeling of that from the films that I watched. How do you think the same?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in terms of remakes, more generally, I don't generally see the point of them. I think if it's just to make them more sellable or saleable, because people don't like to read subtitles, I don't personally have a lot of patience for that, because I'm just like, guys, just read subtitles. Like, the world is so rich, like you can't really. I mean, I know films like Akira Kurosawa's films like Seven Samurai have been remade into like Magnificent Seven, but like you don't need to. Like, Seven Samurai is a perfect film. So I feel like there's this kind of, with remake culture, that's like a worrying homogenizing of culture. It's about making it American normally, or certainly Anglophone at least. And I just think it's unnecessary. I mean, that said, there are of course remakes where they're very, very good, but I haven't prepared this in advance, but if I think about the remakes I love, they would tend to be maybe Western remakes of Western films, so things like like The Thing, or like Cronenberg's The Fly. Those are kind of like auto-cannibalistic films which are kind of reinterpreting the same, a film from the same culture. When you're kind of importing it across like J-horror or whatever it might be, I kind of think we're taking out some of the beauty and some of the detail and some of the richness of those films by transporting them to another context.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be of the same opinion. I just don't think you can. Yeah, I just don't think you can get the same heart. Like I said, it doesn't have the same feeling. It doesn't have the same heart. It doesn't have the same atmospheric kind of beauty that the original one set in the original community and the original culture has. So stop remaking. Stop remaking these films. Just watch the originals.
Leave them alone.
Yeah. So let's get on to our first film. Would you like to introduce it and give us a brief synopsis, please?
I will certainly try. So the film which I selected was 2017's Terrified by Damien Rugna. And so the plot, such as it is, of Terrified, without going into spoilers, is about a series of paranormal encounters that take place in 3 homes on the same street in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. And I don't want to get into spoilers.
We do spoilers on this.
Oh, we do spoilers?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Cool. Makes it a bit easier.
Okay. I'll say this then, that Terrified opens with, it lives up to its name pretty quickly, because within about the first 15 to 20 minutes, it is fully terrifying. Like, I don't feel like I scare particularly easy, but I was rattled. So it begins.
Same. Yes. Yeah, I'm quite a silent viewer. Like, I'll watch film and I'm very quiet. This one had me shouting at the TV. Like, I'm not going to lie. I was that person shouting at the TV from this opening scene.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to that thing about culture and remakes, I think there's something about the way the shocks is delivered in Terrified, the way that Rugner kind of um, sets out a sequence which is quite antithetical
Mm.
to a typical American film. Well, I mean, the kind of classic cliche in like Western horror films is the jump scare, right? Where
Yeah.
you get the full scare and then the real scare, but there's something about the way it builds and is just drenched in dread, terrified.
Yeah.
And so like the opening scene follows a woman called Clara who's hearing voices coming from the plug hole in her kitchen sink, and her husband Juan is worried about this. And then like later that night, he's in bed. He can just hear this banging in what he assumes to be the neighbor. And he goes into the bathroom, and her body is being levitated by some unseen force and just slammed mercilessly into the wall until she is just a bloody ragdoll. I mean, if that's not bad enough, we then quickly move into the sequence with the neighbor, who was wrongly thought of to be this kind of noisy neighbor, a poor guy, I think called Walter, who is convinced that there's something under his bed, and so it sets up this camera to try and video it, and catches just like a genuinely deeply frightening series of images of like this tall pale figure that is under the bed, and then he realizes is in his closet, and then there's this shot of him like watching this video back with this face starts to emerge out of the shadows behind him. I mean, and that alone, like your blood pressure's gone up about like 50 points by that point.
Yeah. I really feel that like like James Wan and the Conjuring universe could learn something from Terrified, because it's not all just quiet bang scare. It's like this slow kind of dread, especially when he's looking under the bed and you're like, okay, there's nothing there, you expect something to be there, and it's when he's looking back on the video and that thing crawls out. No.
Yeah. It's done so well. It's done so well. But yeah, and then of course like the third supernatural event, which is in a way even slower, but it's more powerful for it. I'm like a big fan of actually slowing the scares down. I think that's actually where a lot of the power is. So like one of my favorite examples is from the Mario Bava film, Black Sabbath, which is the kind of series of short stories, and there's the last one in that movie, the A Drop of Water, where a corpse rises from the bed and just turns to face somebody and kind of walks towards them, and it's as simple as that, but it's just drawn out horrendously slowly, and it's so terrifying because of that pacing. So the last event in the Buenos Aires house is where a little boy has been killed in a tragic car accident, and then his dead body has just turned back up sitting at his kitchen table with a glass of milk. And as if that's not scary enough, the two paranormal investigators, I think one of them's a paranormal investigator, maybe one of them's a cop or a coroner, they go into the other room and then they hear, or then they return to the body, and like the milk's been knocked over as if the child was trying to drink it. It's such a powerful image.
It was the bit where he was like leaning down trying to like look at the boy, and and I was just like, oh my god, like it actually ignited so much anxiety in me. It was just amazing the way it was done. Such a simple sequence, but it was just so anxiety inducing and terrifying.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. Have you seen the Irish film Caveat on Shudder?
I have, yes.
So yeah, I mean, were you a fan of that one?
I liked some aspects of it. I liked how, again, drawn out it is, and how when you see that which is meant to scare you, it is quite a jump. I thought the story was a bit convoluted, a bit kind of all over the place, but generally I quite liked it.
Cool. I mean, just this sequence kind of puts me in mind of, without spoiling anything for Caveat, because that's quite a new film, but like there's a moment in the last 20 minutes which very much reminds me of this, where like you're just waiting for something to happen, and then when it happens, it's comparatively incremental. Like it's like the glass of milk being knocked over, but because you're so amped up by that point, like the slightest thing feels like it's a cataclysmic earthquake. Yeah, definitely. I mean, so basically, Terrified then, if that's the setup, then 3 paranormal investigators resolve to basically investigate what's happening on the street. And for some reason, think it is a good idea for them to split up into these 3 different houses on the same night and then observe what happens. And needless to say, all hell breaks loose.
Literally, yeah. I
Literally.
always wonder, like, do these people live in a world of horror films? Because we all know you don't split up. Like,
I know, guys, like, you're literally a paranormal investigator. This should be your bread and
yeah.
butter. But
And they're all quite like, they're quite elderly as well. So you're like, you have to look after each other. Like, you know, and one of the detective has like a heart problem. And you're like, don't split up.
yeah, absolutely. You know, it's fantastic. I think there's something about the way it unfolds as well in that kind of second and third acts, which is fairly relentless and fairly disorientating. I think it's fair to say. I mean, like the kind of the reveal towards the end is that these are some kind of interdimensional beings who are kind of breaking through into our reality. And so it's kind of almost like it's kind of a cosmic horror, almost like an alien horror, but like, although it's never really, I mean, it's definitely, its trappings are more supernatural, and like kind of possession movies and that kind of stuff. But it's really, from a plot point of view, that's not what it's doing. But because it is so disorientating and so it feels so like drenched in otherness, it feels very much out of control and very, very unsafe. I think the second and third acts, as that investigation gradually collapses with different people meeting gruesome ends, and
And how did you feel about the ending and how it kind of, it doesn't really answer any questions, does it? It's left very kind of what's the word? Yeah,
I'm a big fan of that. I think there's something beautiful in leaving stuff unresolved and hanging, and I think often actually when people then return to the well of through sequels or remakes or whatever and trying to explain things, that's where often problems can arise. Like for me, one of the best / worst examples of this was when Ridley Scott was interviewed, I think maybe either before Prometheus, I think it was before Prometheus, and he was talking about his justification for wanting to go back, and he was like, well, no one really ever explained where the alien came from, and I wanted to tell that story. And I thought, well, why? Like, you kind of, it kind of, to me, kind of suggested that maybe you didn't understand the power of that original film, because that first film, there is no explanation. It's just, this is just an organism that does not care. Like, I think that's that quote from Ian Holmes' character, Ash the android, where like it's the perfect organism unclouded by morality. And it's just, there's a purity to that first film. So similarly, like with Terrified, the fact that it is very loose-endish, feels like very much you've just experienced this kind of unknowable situation, which has been incredibly, as the name says, like terrifying and inexplicable, and then it just finishes, and it's really tight. It's like 87 minutes long. For me, I'm a big fan of that kind of short, sharp punch to the throat kind of films.
I could come and go with this. Like, some films I feel could really do with an explanation, and it really needs to kind of come together because perhaps the story isn't strong enough to support kind of an unambiguous kind of ending. Whereas I think with Terrified, it's almost scarier because there is no explanation, because you barely know what the hell is going on, what these creatures are, how they appeared in this community. And it's almost adds to the fear a little bit.
No, I completely agree.
I
completely agree.
So how did you feel about the setting? Obviously, it's set in a community in Buenos Aires, and usually with kind of like haunted house horror, it's kept to the one house, whereas this is a neighborhood. So how did you feel about that point?
I liked it very much. I mean, I think maybe this is tying into what we were saying earlier about how things have that kind of richness of cultural detail by having them set in countries other than, for example, the States or countries which we're more familiar with. And this idea of community as well, which is really important in the film. There's a sense about tragedies having befallen a series of neighbours, whilst because certainly in the UK and in the States, there's quite a culture of individualism and like the cliche, an Englishman's house is his castle, and looking out for number one and all that stuff. And it feels like it's really it's really great seeing something with slightly different emphasis than that. I think the other thing about locating it in Argentina as well, and this is never really hammered home, particularly in the film, but it's kind of interesting to kind of consider then like the political and social history of Argentina. So you had like the coup d'état in '76 in Argentina, when there was the overthrow of a democratically elected president, Isabel Perón, and military dictatorship was installed. And this was something which is openly then supported by the states. So you had like U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger at the time went to see the dictatorship several times and very much seemed to kind of codify that illegitimate rule. And then like this, then the human rights violations under the dictatorship were kind of astronomical. You had something like 30,000 forced disappearances over the course of their installment, and lots of extrajudicial arrests, mass executions, torture, rape, these kind of disappearances of prisoners and dissenters. And interestingly as well, when we talk about that little boy reappearing at the table, the illegal relocation of children. And so what I think is interesting by this being an Argentine story is this kind of idea that you're living your normal life and then something unknowable happens, which has been orchestrated or carried out by these unknowable forces, which completely violates your home life. Like, so you literally see within the series of like, those three events, the murder of a woman who the husband is then blamed for the killing. This other guy goes missing with some kind of creepy like figure under the beds. That's kind of perhaps like the idea of reds under the beds has been like this kind of other kind of language of political dissonance. And then this child disappears and reappears again. And so you kind of feel like we're using genre trappings to kind of play around with fantastical representations of the fears which have been very real for the Argentine people. So I think for all that stuff as well, just gives it a real weight and gives it a real depth, which although it's never spelled out in a didactic, this is a metaphor, this is a simile, it's feels very much it's drawing on that sense of national trauma being processed, which I think it does. It adds like another level of quality to it, I think, as a film.
I agree with all of that. I couldn't have said it any better. I got from it kind of the theme of kind of inter-community trauma and how that trauma is shared, and how it kind of, even though it could be, a time has gone since this trauma has happened, it never really leaves that community. The ghosts of this trauma linger on. Especially, I kind of related it to, what happens in Ireland and Northern Ireland. We're still kind of recuperating from the Troubles and how it still affects our communities. And so I kind of related it to that a bit. Obviously, it's nowhere near what happens in Argentina. But yeah, that's what I kind of got from it. And I love that you couldn't place this story anywhere else. It has to be in Argentina. It has to be within this community. And I think that's why I really, really enjoyed this film.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It goes back to, I guess, our original comments about horror being a kind of therapy that I think unless you've been in a nation which has experienced that kind of collective national trauma, it's very difficult to then automatically tune in to films or filmmakers from those nations who are doing those things. I think, I'm a massive fan of Japanese cinema, like not just horror films, but like, from every genre. And I think post-war Japanese films as well are similarly so interesting because it's like a post-imperial power wrestling with the fact that they were on the losing side and arguably on the wrong side of like this cataclysmic war. And I think like there's I wouldn't say arguably on the wrong side, just to be clear. This isn't like a private conversation. It goes out on the interweb where it's open to misinterpretation. Just to be really clear, fascism is bad, kids. But but I'm interested in that kind of psychic collective processing of it, and I think it's so important. Again, like just being able to kind of have those conversations in a safe space where like no one's literally worried about trans-dimensional beings breaking out your plot hole. Well, you might be after this film.
Well, maybe, yeah.
But the idea of like a military coup, like an idea of like people coming for your family or taking your kids, like that stuff is the reality for a lot of people, and that certainly has been the reality in living memory. And so, yeah, again, I think it's just doing fantastic footwork in terms of navigating difficult emotional territory in a really deft and really powerful way.
Yeah. So would you recommend Terrified to horror audiences?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say it is very scary. So if you're somebody who is like a casual horror watcher, maybe just be advised going into it. But I think if you're a devotee of the genre, I think you're going to love it.
Yeah. And I think also it's a great kind of foray into Latin America horror. If, like me, you were completely kind of ignorant of this kind of area of the genre, I think it's a great kind of gateway into a very kind of individual style of horror.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's worth saying that Del Toro, who we mentioned earlier, has a couple of years ago announced that he's planning to remake this. So, I trust Del Toro, but obviously that's the intersection of there's a remake and do we need a remake? I mean, it's interesting is that we don't need a remake, but no. I also respect. I mean, Del Toro is a great champion of Latino voices. He also was fully behind like Issa Lopez's Tigers Are Not Afraid, which is also on Shudder. It's a fantastic Mexican film. But also, like last year during lockdown, Rugner it kind of disclosed in an interview with Rue Morgue that he was working on a sequel for Terrified. Yeah. So, I mean, we'll see what happens with that. I don't know if that's going to come to pass or not. And I hope he doesn't tie up too many loose ends. Yes. I hope it's another kaleidoscopic nightmare with no reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's interesting. Yeah, we might maybe we'll still get more in the Terrified universe either through the Del Toro funded or backed remake or the Rugner scripted sequel.
Yeah, I'm hoping for more sinkhole horror.
Sinkhole horror. Yeah, absolutely.
So let's move on to the second movie, which I chose. It is called Morto no Fala, which means Dead Don't Speak. It is a 2019 Brazilian film directed and written by Denison Romalho. And it follows Stenio, who played by Daniel de Oliveira, and he has a gift for communicating with the dead, specifically corpses that land on his slab in his morgue, because he is a mortician assistant. And it's such an interesting premise for the film. I really enjoyed the premise, not so much the undertaking of it. I kind of felt like the corpses were a bit weird. When he's speaking to them, it's like they used a lot of digital effects, whereas I think it would have been better if they'd used practical effects. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think the thing with digital effects is that they can be quite unsuccessful quite easily, right? Like I had had an interview last year with Dan Martin, who's the effects artist for Possessor, and he was saying what's interesting with digital effects is it could be 99% out, but if it's 1% out, your eye's going to spot it.
Yeah.
While with practical effects, there's because it's all tangible, it's a lot more easily forgivable, and so yeah, definitely it's kind of something which is it's just a tricky line to walk, right? Isn't it?
Yeah. I just felt it would have been a lot more believable. I mean, obviously talking to corpses isn't that believable, but it would have been a lot more believable in this situation if they'd just done corpse makeup on someone and
for sure.
Yeah. So while talking to a corpse on his slab, he learns that his wife is having an affair with the bakery guy who she works with, and he decides to put in motion a plan which results in his wife and her lover being murdered. And then his wife decides to go full on haunted house poltergeist possession on the whole household and terrifies Stenio and his two children. Yes, it. First of all, how did you feel about the film? Did you like the film?
So I should have said this at the top, to be upfront, I haven't actually been able to catch the film yet. So I'm sorry. I realized as we started speaking, I was like, I think I may have misunderstood the parameters of the podcast. We're like, I watch one, you watch one. I was supposed to watch both, wasn't I? I do apologize.
It's okay.
But maybe I can ask you a question. I was going to ask, like, how do you feel about this idea of like the vengeful female ghost or the vengeful female woman in particularly a supernatural film? Like, what's your kind of currency with that?
I actually, funnily enough, you said this. I actually made a point about this film. I feel that with the vengeful female figure, in this case, it's his wife. They're always painted to be like, the baddie, the villain. They're what we have to defeat and kill off and blah blah blah. And yes, she was having an affair, but that's just normal. She's just being human. Mm-hmm. And it was Stenio who basically got her killed because he was acting out of a place of machismo, and instead of just being like, okay, my wife's had an affair, shit, he decided to get her and her lover killed. And I just feel like there's too much sympathy for that character.
Yeah.
And we are meant to, feel bad for him that his wife has come back and wants to kill him and make his life a living hell. But like, why shouldn't she? He killed her. Yeah. Why shouldn't she?
Yeah. And it's interesting because there's that the mythology of Lilonia, and again, apologies for my pronunciation, but this weeping widow who comes to steal away children. She's like a spectre or folkloric presence in Latino Mexican folklore. And it is interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of those representations of women tend to be around male anxiety about female sexuality. And so if we're talking about linking it specifically to an affair, and without commenting one way or the other about the morality of that, I think like most people would agree that infidelity, whoever it's committed by, is a betrayal of trust on the other party. But when we're talking about it in terms of like a female adulteress who is then killed by her husband coming back to haunt, it's very much like the kind of the question about male anxiety over female sexual power is very much on the table, it feels, as a theme. It doesn't sound like you were massively a fan of the way it was handled, though.
No, I just think that it is a trope that is too kind of played out a lot. The angry woman who got what was coming to her, but now, even though she's been killed, she has to basically be killed again for the second time. I mean, the only thing I kind of had a bit of an issue was the way she also wanted to kill her children. But I kind of feel like that was maybe, again, from real life kind of issues that happen in Brazil, in Sao Paulo especially. There is a very big thing about infanticide. Yeah, infanticide. And I kind of feel like that was a reflection on that. There's a book called Death Without Weeping, which is basically about mothers who kill their children because of whatever is going on socially, economically, politically. It's a really bad book. I had to read it for my anthropology degree. And so, yeah, I was kind of a bit and ahhing about that, but I could almost understand why it was added in. But I just wish it had been a little bit less, look at that crazy bitch coming back to life, and more kind of about Stenio and how he's actually the villain in this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the infanticide angle as well, it feels very much of a Lilonia trope as well. Like she killed her kids and then comes to snatch away other kids. And there's something there, isn't there, about female violence against children in particular being still one of those massive taboos, both socially and cinematically. So maybe a slight spoiler for Possessor for like 30 seconds, but there's a moment at the end of Possessor which is still shocking, just to have an on-screen murder of a child committed by the mother. And yeah, I mean, some interesting ideas then in the sandbox here, but yeah, if you're not going to interrogate the male privilege or the male power, which kind of set a lot of those wheels in motion, you're kind of missing that crucial part of the puzzle to have that conversation, right?
I just wish they'd focused on that a bit. I mean, there was a lot of focus on like the kind of like the peripheral issues going on. So we had like a lot of gang violence in it, mention of police brutality, mention of femicide. So like Terrified, I liked how they set it very much within that community, within what happens in, say, the more vulnerable communities within Brazilian cities like Sao Paulo, because like all good horror, it does reflect what is actually happening in society. So that was like my main, I really liked that aspect, but yeah, just the gendered side of things, I was a bit about.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think like gender in horror films in general continues to be like both one of the most interesting sources for examination. I think feminist readings of horror like have yielded so much good fruit, and yet there's also continues to be quite a strong seed of misogyny in horror films as well, which is like, have we not dealt with this yet? But yeah, so it's kind of still like that troubling thing that is still kind of like dogging the genre.
Absolutely. So from what I have described about Morto na Fala, does that make you want to watch it, or are you kind of like,
I would definitely give it. I mean, like gendered reads of horror films are something I absolutely love. I feel like this some of the best stuff I think that's been made in recent years has been around this topic. I mean, you've written a excellent essay for Moving Pictures Film Club, which is going to drop in a few weeks on the Babadook, Jennifer Kent's film, which is fabulous. And we mentioned Issa Lopez's Tigers Are Not Afraid, and like female-centric stories are like just so, at the moment it feels very much so vital and so powerful in the horror genre. As I said, I've not seen loads and loads of Latino horror films, and so I'd definitely give this a whirl just to kind of widen my scope. But it doesn't sound that maybe it's as successful as Terrified or some of those other titles that we've name checked.
Yeah, I definitely think that Terrified is perhaps, if I had to recommend one over the other, I definitely think Terrified would be, just for its kind of subtle take on issues within Argentina, and that it actually makes it really, really scary, as it actually is in real life. So do you think that you will be exploring more Latin America titles? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, I mentioned Shudder earlier, and Shudder have been doing like a great job about putting a lot of these titles out there. So, I mean, earlier this year we had The Old Ways, which, I mean, it isn't really it's a Latino set horror film. It's actually directed by an American, but with a Latino cast, which is pretty decent. Skull the Mask as well, for Armando Finesco and Capel Furman, came out a few weeks ago on Shudder as well. So it feels like that stuff is becoming more and more accessible. But yeah, absolutely, we'll continue to go back to that well and yeah.
Yeah, I think Shudder has been absolutely amazing in championing. I can't speak. It's late. In pushing horror from other cultures, and I think it is such a great resource. And it seems to have really gotten its stride within the past year or so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, with everything that's happened, but yeah, I love Shudder.
Yeah, no, it's been incredible. It was about this time last year that they released Rob Savage's Host, which was, of course, probably one of the big films of Lockdown 1.
Yeah.
And it just feels like every month they're bringing out like stuff which is either really good or at the very, very least really important and really interesting. So they had like the Los Romero movie, the amusement park, I should say, by a little kind of sidebar, that arguably Ramiro is half Latino,
Okay.
which I hadn't realized. I think his mother was Lithuanian.
Yeah.
His father was Spanish, but had grown up in Cuba, and so
Okay.
there's like a tangential
Yeah.
link to bring him Ramiro.
Yeah.
uh, but yeah, like lots of great stuff on
Mm,
his shoulder. I mean, obviously not. If you're a horror fan, if we're honest, you've all seen like a fair amount of stuff which is less good. So it's not all killer, but like there's definitely been a lot of really good stuff over the last 6 months or so, and yeah.
absolutely. So before we go, I always ask, what is your favorite horror film?
Is an excellent question. I think I'm going to be really cliched and
Mm.
say The Exorcist.
Oh, mine too.
Oh, okay, good stuff. Good stuff. What's your relationship with The Exorcist?
I was a massive fan of the book. The book creeped me the hell out, and I just feel, obviously, because William Peter Blatty also wrote the screenplay and also basically headhunted William Friedkin, that it was just the most perfect adaptation of the book, and it's terrifying, and it, I'm really into my possession and kind of religious themed horror, even though I'm an atheist. It's just something that really gets me, and I just think it still terrifies me to this day.
Yeah, that's
What about
incredible.
you?
Yeah, no, I think I first saw it. We had the version that you've never seen that came out in the late '90s, and I think I
Mm,
went to see it like 3 times at the pictures. And I mean, weirdly, like I have not been particularly frightened by it, but I just find it
mm,
really powerful, like emotionally,
yeah.
because it's not just a scary movie about the devil possessing this little girl. It's also like these huge themes of like good versus evil, and what it means to give your life for something, and what it
Hmm.
means to like wrestle with faith and doubt. And like, yeah, I mean, I love Blatty as well. I think this is part of his trilogy of faith with the Ninth
Yeah.
Configuration and Exorcist 3, and I love certainly Ninth Configuration. I think is
Hmm.
absolutely fantastic. Exorcist 3, I think, is very good, although probably not on a par with the other two. But yeah, I just love those kind of big questions, because again, I don't think people in culture ask enough of those big questions,
Hmm.
like why are we here, what do you actually believe about God or
Yeah.
the absence of God, and like how are you going to like wrestle with those things. And I think
Hmm.
to do that in a genre film is for me, it's whenever I watch The Exorcist, like I'm away, like I've had almost like it's been like almost like a cleansing rain for my
Hmm.
soul. I kind of just like come out of it feeling refreshed and like seeing the world anew again. And I think it's
Yeah.
a incredible, revitalizing piece of work.
Yeah. So if people would like to find you on the socials, where can they find you?
Yeah, cool. So I'm on Twitter at fatscoleman, FATSCOLEMN, or you can come over to movingpicturesfilmclub.com for writing by myself and lots of other people.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm once again really sorry for already having
It's
watched one of those films. I feel like I kind of missed an essential part of that brief. But
it's fine. We still had a good chat.
absolutely.
So that was my chat there with Tim Coleman about 2 horror films that come from the continent of South America or Latin America. So that is 2017's Terrified from Argentina, which you can find on Shudder, and also Morto no Fala, which is from Brazil. Which I found on YouTube if you're looking for it. I know sometimes it can be a bit hard to find, but there you go. And I hope, like me, this encourages you to seek out more films from that corner of the world. Because, like myself and Tim Coleman chatted about, they have such a strong social commentary about them, about a culture and a community that you may not know anything about, may not be privy to. And it's just really interesting to see, like a lot of other horror movies, how they reflect, the socio-economic and the politics and everything going on within that country. So as always, you can catch us on social media, Instagram or Facebook at What a Scream Podcast. You can find me on Twitter at what_scream. And that's how you're going to keep up with us. And I really hope that whatever podcast streaming service you're listening to us on, you comment and subscribe and review and all that fun stuff. And if you are watching us on YouTube, subscribe there and then go over to a podcast streaming service and review and subscribe there as well, please. As always, I hope you are staying safe and you're doing okay, and as always, stay horrific. Goodbye. Shouldn't be scared of the Dracula. Shouldn't be scared of the